All right, can you guys hear me? Excellent, great. Okay, so welcome to our discussion today. We're going to focus on U.S. companies that are implementing the transition to net zero, and we're going to look at experiences across different sectors. My name is Verena Radulovic. I'm the Vice President for Business Engagement at a nonprofit called the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan climate policy think tank, and we work to advance the transition to a net zero emissions economy that is just and resilient as well. As part of our efforts to do that, we work with large leading companies across many sectors to have them help inform us in policies that make sense, as they are on the forefront of trying to also advance the decarbonization of our economy. With us today, we have 4 of those companies. We have Honeywell, GE, National Grid, and Google, and each of them are going to tell a different story in how advancing technologies such as sustainable aviation fuel and hydrogen, building the component, building the components that we need for a low carbon future. Then thinking about the supply of that energy, and then we also have the perspective of the demand of that energy, whether it be 24/7 clean, as well as thinking about how we remove carbon. So we're going to dive into a conversation that is really focused on technologies, and I'd like to introduce the panelists here to my left, to your right, and I will be asking each of them a series of questions for them to talk about their company's efforts, and then we'll dive into some common questions and themes. So with me we have Ben Driggs. He is the president of High Growth Regions at Honeywell. Roger Martella, who's the chief sustainability officer for GE. Guy van Nieuwenhove, who's senior vice president, National Grid Ventures. And Mars Hanna, the head of sustainability at Google. Head of sustainability and climate policy, I should say, at Google. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn to Ben to start. And I'll give a little flavor on what is happening at each of the companies. So Honeywell announced new pledges in the last year that include developing a science-based target that includes some of their Scope 3 emissions to add to the already goal of carbon-neutral facilities and operations by 2035. Last year, 60% of Honeywell's research and development investments for new products was directed toward ESG-oriented outcomes, and more than 60% of the sales were also from ESG-oriented solutions. So I'd like to ask Ben to dive into some of those. Specifically, Ben, I'm curious about sustainable aviation fuel, as well as efforts to increase the energy efficiency of buildings. Can you talk to us about those?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about SAF and building energy efficiency. You know, we kind of look at Honeywell. You need to look at both the supply side in making fuels greener and have less of a carbon impact. And then you also need to look at the demand side. How do you actually reduce demand and get the same output in various processes? So sustainable aviation fuel, we have one of the leading processes to produce that. About 80% of the SAF produced today uses Honeywell's process technology to transform various feedstocks into SAF. And of course, it's a small market today, but there's a lot of new projects, and I think we've won 9 of the 12 announced projects that are coming forward for sustainable aviation fuel. And The key thing that we find for SAF, first, every airline I talk to is extremely interested in SAF. They know that in the medium term, near term and the medium term, that is the best way for airlines to meet their carbon reduction goals. And what they really need is availability of SAF, and a lot of what that comes down to is feedstock. And what we have really focused on is developing a process that can take the biggest variety of feedstocks to produce SAF. So our process has been proven with about 32 different feedstocks, everything from used cooking oil to jatropha to algae to agricultural waste of various kinds. And it's really that feedstock flexibility that's so important, because if you focus on one feedstock, then the price of that feedstock will go up really significantly. You need that flexibility to have kind of the right market response. And then you also need good yields. And that is where our process, and we're constantly working on improving the yield, but generally the feedstock's producing a very high yield, very similar you'd get from a crude input, and something that we're very proud of, but constantly focused on doing that. And we see an incredible demand and need for this. And what's so important is that people take the effort to secure the feedstocks, whether it's collection of used cooking oil, collection of animal fat, really working on agricultural processes that keep this waste, and that's kind of the critical thing going forward. And then buildings, I'll just very briefly touch on that. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. And the great thing about buildings are existing technology you can put into buildings to reduce the air conditioning or heating loads, to be more smart and efficient in that. And we found even in very efficient buildings, you can reduce that energy consumption by 10, or in older buildings that are inefficient, up to 20%. So very important part of the story of how do you sort of solve these problems long term. So that's a couple of things that we're doing.
Before I go to Roger, I'd want to push on that a little bit. Talk to me about how customer demand is evolving in both the U.S. as well as in global markets, and what are some of the largest drivers behind that demand in these different regions?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's really two drivers. One is regulatory. So certainly when the EU went and said 2025, you've got to have SAF, there's going to be penalties if you're not using this, and looking at blends, that creates a lot of demand. But the other demand, and this shouldn't be underestimated, is the ESG goals individual airlines have created for themselves. And they have these goals, they want to show progress. I'll point to the deal that we signed with United Airlines along with Alder Fuels, Honeywell, and United. And this wasn't necessarily a requirement, but it's what they wanted to do, and it's how they wanted to brand themselves. So I think the company's goals in and of themselves are very true. And you see building owners. People want to rent out buildings that are LEED Platinum. They want to rent out buildings that are certified green. And so regulatory frameworks certainly help, are critical, but also you see companies wanting to do this on their own, given their own commitments, and consumers wanting to do this on their own is also a very important factor.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to Ben in a moment after the others speak, but I'd like to move over to Roger from GE. So as many of you know, GE is a major supplier of energy infrastructure across wind, gas, nuclear, and a major manufacturer of aircraft engines. And so GE also recently committed to carbon neutrality in its own operations by 2030 and announced an ambition to be net zero for its sold products by 2050. So Roger, tell us a little bit about how has the market shifted in the last 2 years for wind, gas, and SAF-ready aircraft engines, both globally and in the U.S.?
Well, Raina, thank you for the question, and thank you to you and C2S for your leadership here at COP27. It's really an outsized impact that you and C2S are having, and so honored to be part of this with my colleagues, but wanted to really thank you for that leadership. So in terms of the last 2 years, they've been quite transformational. Many companies and many of our customers were on a trajectory towards net zero prior to 2 years ago, but we've certainly seen an acceleration of our customers, both in the energy space and the aviation space, towards, I think as Ben was talking about, towards wanting to decarbonize their footprint. So as you mentioned, we're the innovators of technology. Our equipment helps provide 1/3 of the world's energy, and 3 out of every 4 planes use GE engines. So we have this role to play in terms of making sure we're innovating the technology so that our customers can realize their goals, whether those are net zero or decarbonization goals. So we've seen that uptick in the trends. I think for the aviation sector, the most unified of all sectors. I think almost the entire aviation sector is committed to net zero by 2050. So that one's relatively straightforward. We can talk about how to get there, but that industry is pretty unified. Energy, a little more diverse depending on where you are in the world, but whether you're net zero or not, one of the themes that comes through loud and clear in the energy sector is everybody's looking to decarbonize the energy sector all around the world, but they want to increase resiliency at the same time. They want to grow access to affordable, reliable, sustainable electricity. As we sit here in Egypt, it's a really important consideration, balancing both of those. So we've seen this almost unification in goals this way in the last 2 years, and now we're seeing, I think at this point as we sit here today, an interest from making goals to delivering on those goals, to operationalizing these issues and understanding the roadmaps and the pathways to get there. So lots of commitments, lots of announcements. Now people want to see the technology and what's the way to get there. So we have laid out roadmaps both for energy and aviation. For energy, it's focused on this decade and beyond. This decade, more utilization of renewables, obviously. In many places in the world, switching from coal to gas to decarbonize the emissions and increase the resiliency of the grid so they can grow more renewables and a more rigorous grid. We also look beyond 2030 for the breakthrough technologies, and there we see hydrogen as a fuel, carbon capture sequestration, small modular reactors, but we have to be investing in those technologies today. We can't wait till 2030. So we're doing all the legwork now, and we've laid out a roadmap for what we're doing with this decade so we can introduce those. On the aviation side, obviously sustainable aviation fuel is probably the number one growth factor for decarbonizing the aviation sector. I think as Ben talked about, the focus is there on the pipeline. Our technology can currently use sustainable aviation fuel. So we're keeping abreast of it. Now we're a little bit ahead in terms of the technology. And the Inflation Reduction Act will help develop that pipeline. But we're not resting on sustainable aviation fuel. We're working on the next generations of technology, whether that's open rotor, open fan design that will reduce emissions by 20%. Hybrid electric engines, hydrogen planes. There will be a diverse mix of aviation in the future that will help enable decarbonization. And like the breakthrough technologies on energy, we're working on those right now so that we can be ready by 2030. And you're dealing with safety, you're dealing with the laws of physics, long product cycles. Very complicated, but something we're really excited to do. And then in terms of barriers, I'd say there's two. There's the technology and there's the policy. I think Ben talked about, on the technology side, there's the feedstock barriers, that our technology is probably ahead of where the feedstocks are. On hydrogen, our turbines can run on hydrogen. On SAF, our engines can run on SAF. We've got to develop those feedstocks. We've got a great story about running Sharm el-Sheikh power on hydrogen in a couple of days that hopefully we can turn to. Actually, I just mentioned it right now. I was at the facility this morning. So we're going to run on Monday the electricity for this blue zone, and Sharm el-Sheikh will run on hydrogen, a blend of hydrogen, for the first time on the African continent for a few hours. And
will we see the turbine outside?
I'm sorry?
Will we actually see the turbine outside, or will it be coming from elsewhere?
Yeah, you're welcome to go. I saw the turbine today, and what they did is, the reason we wanted to focus on this is we wanted to create that logistical framework to invest Africa in these breakthrough technologies. So we had to get a truck from Kuwait to transport the hydrogen. We had to move it to Cairo to load the hydrogen. We had to bring it here. And then we had to create all the safety and the logistical infrastructure to literally blend the hydrogen. But now that we've done this for the first time on the African continent, we hope that's precedent for other nations. And so we're really proud of that. It shouldn't just be a US-EU issue. So there's the technological constraints, and then the policy constraints. The Inflation Reduction Act is obviously a breakthrough there. Super optimistic about that, but we have to be united in how we implement it, make sure that we're helping the administration succeed and not slowing them down. And of course, permitting and making sure we're getting the right permitting reforms in so we can streamline a lot of the renewable energy, sustainable aviation fuel pathways, and addressing some of those policies. So we've got some challenges ahead, but we've been given a really strong foundation to succeed at this point.
So before I turn to Guy, I do have one more question for you, Roger. When we think about what Ben was talking about in terms of the developing the feedstock, GE being ready long before the customer is ready to actually use that feedstock, what is one thing from your perspective that can be done to increase demand in the next 2 years?
It's not going to be the most original answer, but I can't do any better than the Inflation Reduction Act. If you want to increase demand, if you want to increase demand, give people the financial incentive to do it. That's exactly what it's done. I think on us, as I mentioned, it's the implementation. We have to be united front in terms of doing everything we can to accelerate the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Thank you, Roger. So I'm going to turn now to Guy, and we're going to talk about National Grid. National Grid has a goal to reach net zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050, and also involves different types of technology deployment, such as reducing methane emissions from transmission, interconnecting large-scale renewables, and developing hydrogen and renewable natural gas, which are the two areas I'm going to be focusing on with Guy. So Guy, tell us, what is National Grid doing on hydrogen and also on RNG?
So, well, thank you very much again for being in this panel today. So National Grid has announced recently the fossil-free gas strategy, which effectively sort of outlines sort of the way we see we will decarbonize and sort of basically shift our sort of whole system into sort of based on sort of 5 different pillars, which is effectively in a world where you see sort of targeted electrification, energy efficiency, and hydrogen and RNG, we see a world where we can deliver decarbonization without a full degree of high electrification. The path to do that, we see it as phased over time. So we've announced that to be delivered in 2050. There is significant progress that we see already by 2030. So by 2030, for example, we expect to already see between 10 to 20% of RNG in our pipes. Now, the reason we came out with that fossil-free gas strategy is because that's the way we believe will be the most affordable, practical, and equitable way of delivering decarbonization. And we see a number of benefits in this sort of practical approach. So on one hand, for example, we see the benefit of repurposing and using existing infrastructure rather than sort of a full build out of new infrastructure. We see the cost benefit, of course, of reducing the investments required over time. So we estimate that to be as big as between 100 to 200 billion that can be avoided by taking this more holistic and hybrid approach of multiple different pillars to deliver decarbonization. And we also see an ultimate benefit to the customers, right? So we estimate that the savings per customer can be up to $1,000 per year. So that's about sort of 20% in our service territories. So these are significant impacts and savings. And then there are a number of other benefits that we see in taking this approach of a hybrid fossil-free strategy, which is we've got existing skills, workforce, 4,000 unionized sort of workers. So we see this as another benefit that we can sort of continue to leverage on that. There's a huge amount of benefits in reducing the some of the sort of specific sort of I was talking about the by repurposing some of these sort of hybrid approach, we will be able to, for example, continue to deploy heat pumps, but at the same time using the gas as a backup. So that hybrid approach, again, has a significant impact in terms of deployment and uptake in consumers. So huge amount of benefits for customers, leveraging the infrastructure that we already have, the skills of the workers that we've got, and an ultimate cost reduction, affordable approach.
And hydrogen and renewable natural gas specifically have faced challenges, both in terms of those costs. And they're also, when I think about renewable natural gas, I think about sustainable aviation fuel in terms of how we get there and how can we scale. Guy, when you look at those two different kinds of technologies, are the barriers exactly the same in terms of, when you see the opportunity in having a hybrid approach, but when we actually get to trying to implement and grow hydrogen as a fuel and then RNG, can you talk about the differences there a bit?
Yeah, let me just start with hydrogen. I think because it's quite important to highlight. I mean, we have a number of pilots already in place in terms of deploying this technology, but I think when you think about scaling up, we need to think about transportation and storage, and this is going to be very important to make sure that is delivered also in a cost-effective way. In terms of transportation, the challenges that we see is, of course, you will have options like at smaller scales, for example, you'll have trucking or you'll have the ability to do that by barge. But I think when you really see this scaling up, at like sort of later in the next sort of decades, the most cost-effective way of doing that is pipelines. So having the ability to develop those pipelines to move the hydrogen from where it is cost-effective into the areas where there is higher demand, I think will be quite critical. The other aspect is to continue, I mean, at the moment, we make reference to the IRA, which makes a significant contribution in terms of lowering the cost of hydrogen, but to make it sustainable over time, we also see the need to find ways to access low-cost renewable sources as well, because ultimately that, I mean, it can, it's about 50 to 70% of the hydrogen cost will be depending on the renewable source. So these are just two good examples. I think the third one I would say, which is also important, is obviously policy. IRA, IIJA, these are, I mean, landmark frameworks that really allow us to kick off the hydrogen economy. But I think after that, we'll really have to work private sector with the public sector to really unlock business models and make it investable at scale. Because in making that investable at scale is where you get low cost of funding, and therefore it continues to help on the cost synergies. So I think that's the way I see it. In terms of RNG, I think it's different. I mean, it's a drop-in kind of, I mean, you can use a lot of the existing infrastructure, so I think the barriers are a little bit different from the sort of network transmission point of view. But of course, there are still some challenges in terms of the supply. The base and the opportunity is great, and the way we see RNG is just basically translating waste into a climate sort of change opportunity, because these emissions would have happened anyway. So I think there is a huge opportunity in North America in terms of food waste, in terms of landfills, so that we can basically leverage to develop that supply chain.
All right, thank you, Guy. We'll come back to some of those issues in just a moment here. Mars, I'll turn to you. So what we've talked about is we talked about the supply, the provision of clean technologies. We have a utility that has the mass delivery of it. And now I'm going to turn to a company that has a really bold, ambitious goal of getting 24/7 clean energy all the time and runs many of the data centers that we use every day. So Google has big goals to achieve net zero emissions across all of its value chain by 2030, to run its operations 100% carbon-free energy by 24/7 by then too, and also to work with the suppliers in their value chains to reduce their emissions, and for the remaining emissions to invest in carbon removals. So last year, just as an example, Google matched 66% of its data center electricity use with regional carbon-free sources on an hourly basis. So Mars, let's start there. Let's talk about 24/7. What does that mean?
Well, thank you so much, Brenna, for the opportunity to participate in this. You just made a good portion of my talking points, so appreciate that. No, but happy to talk about it. So at Google, sustainability has been something we've been focused on for a very long time. It's something that's core to our values as a company. It's something our CEO and our founders care deeply about. We've been carbon neutral for our operations since 2007. We did that very early on at that time through the purchase of high-quality carbon offsets. But we were very clear even then that we needed to find a more methodologically robust means of operating our company in a sustainable manner. So we helped pioneer the corporate renewable energy PPA in 2010. We did our first deal for 114 megawatts of wind in Iowa. And we scaled that up throughout the 2010s. And by 2017, we had purchased as much renewable energy on a megawatt hour basis to match our annual consumption at all of our data centers around the world in that year. So we've tried to be really clear what that means. That's a global and an annual goal. So somewhere in the world, we are purchasing the same quantity of renewable energy as we are consuming at all of our data centers and campuses elsewhere in the world. So that's an exciting goal. It's something we're very proud of. We've maintained that 5 years running. But we're also very clear-headed that this isn't ultimately solving the problem that we need to solve, which is getting grids to zero carbon. So we looked at our procurement method and we said, well, what we really need to do is actually physically operate the data centers on 24/7 carbon-free power. And that's a completely different way of looking at your procurement strategy. And for a company that's growing, it means really fundamentally transforming the way we do business, transforming our procurement model so that we can not only eliminate carbon from our electricity procurement based on our consumption today, but also as we grow, we need to completely transform. So we think this is a great model also because really it's more impactful at driving the decarbonization at a grid-wide level. There was a study released recently by TU Berlin, another one by Princeton University that showed that 24/7 corporate procurement is substantially more impactful at leading to GHG reduction. So we're doing this in a multi-pronged strategy way. We're focused first really on innovative commercial models. So trying to rethink the way we do procurement, not just PPAs and wholesale swaps, but also trying to think about blending different contract structures together. So a great example is work we've done with AES Energy in Virginia. We have a structure with them where they're blending together a number of different resources. There's solar, wind, battery storage, and run-of-river hydro, and they're able to blend all of those different production profiles together into a consumption model for us that's carbon-free in over 90% of hours. So that gets us very far for our Virginia data center specifically. So that's gets us very far along the way for our facilities. Beyond that, new technology. So we want to open the aperture beyond simply wind and solar and look at other kinds of tech that we can procure. We've signed a deal with Fervo Energy in Nevada, which is an advanced geothermal company where they're providing us with always-on clean energy for our Northern Nevada data center using advanced geothermal techniques where they're able to extract more from a particular resource than they otherwise would. And then lastly, it's about policy change. We've heard a lot about that on the panel so far, but we really need to continue to empower consumers, unlock markets, and continue to advance technology deployment through policy. And we're doing that in a number of ways. So we're part of a number of trade organizations. The Clean Energy Buyers Alliance is a very important advocacy org for us as well across the state level and the federal level. Of course, working with C2ES and others. In Europe, we're part of an initiative called the Resource Platform, which is similar. And then just yesterday, actually, we launched something called the Asia Clean Energy Coalition, which is really about unlocking access to clean energy, 24/7 clean energy for corporates in Asia. So we're really excited about that. Beyond that, a number of partnership initiatives, things like the UN 24/7 Energy Compact, which is a multi-sector coalition that brings together cities, businesses, a number of countries, all under the banner of achieving 24/7. So lots of work to do. As you said, Verena, we're at 66% carbon-free, meaning 66% of hours of the year. And so we've got a long way to go, but we're really excited by our prospects.
So I want to go to carbon removals in just a moment with you, Mars, but if you can give the audience a bit of a sense of what are some of the challenges or maybe the conversations that you're having in other countries around 24/7 versus what you're seeing in the United States. Is the tactic different? Is the conversation different? If so, how?
It is different. Different issues we face in different markets. In Europe, one of the primary areas we're focused on is simply having a credible claims mechanism. We sort of take RECs for granted, and the REC tracking system in the U.S. for granted. That doesn't exist in every market, or it exists in different ways. There's guarantees of origin, but they're not always able to be transferred to a corporate buyer. So we try to help ensure that there's no double counting and that there's clear, credible system of claims. In other markets, it's really about access. We don't simply have legal access to purchase clean energy in markets like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and there we'd really encourage policy reform that is going to allow corporate buyers or any retail buyer to be able to directly purchase clean energy. A number of markets also have infrastructure challenges, just difficulties integrating variable resources, surcharges on very opaque surcharges on clean energy resources that don't represent sort of the cost of service regulation that we see in the U.S. states. So it's a variety of different challenges and different by market.
Got it. And so before I circle back to you, Ben, Mars, can you tell us about where and how Google is investing in carbon removals and maybe a top challenge that you're seeing there?
Yeah, thank you. That's so the 24/7 goal is really about our scope 2 and getting to full decarbonization of scope 2. But as you said, we do have a net zero goal that crosses our full supply chain, our full value chain. There's a lot of work happening with our suppliers to help our suppliers be more efficient, to help them procure clean energy. But ultimately, we know that particularly getting from the last 10 to 20% of our value chain, decarbonizing that is going to be very, very difficult. And so we need to invest in carbon removal technology. This is no different at a global level. We've seen the IPCC be very clear that net zero pathways to mid-century, most of them require some kind of carbon removal technology. That's not commercial today. And so we want to be a part of the solution to help bring those technologies online. We're part of an initiative called the First Movers Coalition with the Biden administration that's really focused on making advanced market commitments where, if you say you're going to buy it, they will build it, is the concept there. And so we've made a commitment through an organization called Frontier that's a multi-company initiative with Stripe, Meta, Shopify, and another company that's escaping me at the moment. That's about $1 billion commitment across all of our companies to purchase carbon removal technologies. Lots under consideration there. This is still very early. We're looking at both engineered solutions as well as bioenergy solutions. We want to make sure that they're high permanence and scalable. So we're looking at removal options that are 1,000 years of storage, and that technologies that have pathway to gigaton removal scale by 2050. So it's early days. I think we're going to have to place a lot of bets and fail fast, try different things, and see what gets us down the cost curve and up the maturity scale.
Okay. All right. So I want to open up the floor with a couple of broad questions that I'll ask each of you for your perspective. So all of your companies are in some way involved in the supply and demand of energy. What is needed to enable the grid, specifically in the United States, to deliver reliable and clean power? Let's start with you, Ben.
Thanks. So I think it really comes for Honeywell on two things. One, energy storage is going to be critical, and energy storage to make a more reliable grid is a key part of that. One of the things we're involved in is making that storage more efficient. So we're working on the flow battery concept, which will have much longer duration and higher power density than lithium-ion batteries, which is a critical part of that path go forward. And I think continued focus on more effective storage solutions is part of what needs to be done. Additionally, really having excellent control and visibility to the entire grid is critical, and that's something that as a controls company we take very seriously. And then I'll go back to reducing demand is another key element while getting the same output. Whether I talked earlier about building technologies, controls technologies for air conditioning, heating, and other lighting, but you also look at things like refrigerant gases. We're the largest producer of low global warming refrigerant gases, but they're also more energy efficient. You have to look at all of those different elements of demand reduction, which can also help the resilience. So, just sort of summarize, better storage solutions, critical area of focus, better controls overall, and I know companies like the National Grid and others are constantly upgrading there, and then really got to look at all aspects of electrical demand and say what can we do to reduce that while still getting the same output. So those would be a few thoughts.
All right, Roger, you're up. What needs to change in the grid to make it clean and reliable in the U.S.?
Okay. So you're going to shoot me today because I'm going to give you the obvious answer. It's upgrading the grid, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. So first of all, thank you for asking the question. One of the things I've been really encouraged over the last couple of days is a lot of people are asking about the grid. A lot of people are asking about the digital opportunities for the grid. And the fact that people are asking these questions and they're getting elevated to the discussion I think alone is really significant, because I think this has been the undersold story of how we can address climate, improve access, improve resiliency, and do things as quickly as possible. Because there is a real sense of urgency here. If we even look at what you asked about the U.S., but even if we look at what's happening in the EU, the grid is really the undersold story there, and it's certainly an undersold story in how we can make some progress in the U.S. If we look at the grid, we're under more risks from increased weather events, more demand from electrification, cybersecurity, and of course our good efforts to build renewables itself is reinventing the grid by creating two-way grids, more variability, and how do you manage all of that in real time? So this is really a fundamental question, and it's encouraging to see both the discussion, and it's encouraging to see, you mentioned the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, which devoted a lot of resources to grid. We hadn't seen a lot of activity on that in the last year, which was kind of came through a COP last year. But now we're seeing DOE, I think, really accelerate that, engage, and that's all very positive. And when we think about the grid, I mentioned the 4 risks. We now have to do some of the hard stuff. We need to think about, as we, for example, build offshore, how do we take the power we're generating offshore and bring it to the advantage of the Northeast United States? That involves HVDC. We have to go beyond the radial grids today and make that kind of infrastructure investment that's both good for renewables, but also good for cybersecurity and the resilience for the weather events and the increased electrification. So some of it's the real physical part. Flexible transformers. I think 75% of our transformers are more than 50 years old in the country. And you can have new flexible transformers today that are much more capable of adapting to the variability and making adjustments in real time. So the physical modernization is really critical so we can succeed on all these other goals. But there's also the digital tools that we can use to not only address cyber attacks, but manage the electrons in real time. So if you're predicting a weather outage, you can literally reroute the grid in real time in a matter of microseconds using digital tools. So there's lots of options out there. I think they've been, again, I think it's been kind of the undersold story here, but there's also the things we can do the quickest in order of reducing emissions, improving efficiency, improving resiliency, and addressing some of the immediate problems so we can build out the renewable energy, the breakthrough technologies, and the other issues we've been talking about.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. So Guy, to you, what does the U.S. grid need to look like differently?
Well, I think I'm going to build on obviously all of what has been said so far, because I think it is critical, and that's why part of the reason why we came out with this sort of hybrid fossil-free gas vision is that we recognize these multiple technologies that are needed to provide that diversity. I mean, the grid is the backbone. I mean, and it, in a way, sometimes it's forgotten. We get a huge amount of momentum in terms of the assets that can be connected to the grid, but the grid has to be obviously advanced and reinforced and enable that to happen. So I think that there is an importance in having these multiple sort of sources of technologies that will deliver the decarbonization, and then equally then the interconnection. And that interconnection, I think it is linked to part of the storage example that was given earlier. Like in UK, for example, we connect UK with European countries. So interconnection can be connecting multiple sources of demand and supply, where that is cost effective, where there is surplus with others. And I always remind people, and I have the luxury of working on both sides in UK and US, and I remind people that UK, I mean, some of the states in the US are the size of the countries in Europe. So, I mean, UK it could be seen as just one state. So connecting states can be really, really powerful. So I think those two, I think the diversity of ways to deliver and the interconnection will be critical to develop that backbone.
Mars, what's your perspective?
So the first 2 pillars of our policy agenda for 24/7 really focus on technology and then markets. I want to just acknowledge, I feel like we've made a tremendous step forward on at least the first pillar in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's been said a lot here, but it's hard to understate the significance of that, having policy certainty on technology neutral clean energy, valuing our existing nuclear resources, creating incentives for the next generation of carbon-free technologies, DOE's loan portfolio to help scale deployment. There's almost I'm sure there's more you could ask for, but it's hard to think. Let's not undersell what we've got. So I think getting all of that out the door obviously is a tremendous priority and something that we need to accelerate. The second piece, just to double down on what Guy said, is really around markets for us and expanding large regional wholesale markets. We've consistently found that the markets that are the largest, the most transparent, are the most conducive to integration of variable renewable energy resources and cost-efficient pricing that delivers value for consumers and helps bring new clean energy onto the grid quickly. We don't have those in every part of the U.S. today. We have them in many parts, but not all. And so expanding competitive electricity markets to across the United States, I think, is a big opportunity.
I do want to get into the Inflation Reduction Act and the, not to be forgotten, the bipartisan infrastructure law that when we combine both of those as a 1-2 punch to get us to clean energy. But I want to get into it a little bit because the two questions I have are what does that do to catalyze investment in your own company? And then what else needs to happen in the way that the government deploys or implements that part of the Inflation Reduction Act that is so critical to success? I think there's a thinking that the money goes and then success happens, but we all know that that's a bit more complicated. So the two questions are what specifically does the Inflation Reduction Act do for your company's ability to invest or invest more, and then what needs to happen in the implementation to make sure that this delivers? Ben, I'll start with you, but I realize you're without a mic.
So what I would say is, one, it sort of confirms the investments we were making and encourages us to do more. I mean, really, in terms of that. And already, and you read in the beginning, the percentage of our R&D budget that's going into ESG-related solutions. But again, it's a great endorsement and encouragement for us to do more. I think the implementation, it's still early days, and we're working with our customers to understand exactly what that will mean and how that will go forward. I think, as you mentioned, that is the critical part of this. We're seeing more interest. There's interest was high before. The interest is even higher now. And I think it's really incumbent for technology providers to work very closely with their customers on really understanding this, because that will be the critical thing, and to also give very quick feedback to the government and make sure that loop continues. So that'd be a couple of my thoughts.
Thank you. And I agree with all that. And I would say the impact has been the certainty, right? That when you have a 10 years of certainty, you can make the types of big investments that these types of projects warrant. Take offshore wind, take some of these breakthrough technologies. GE itself does not largely benefit from these tax credits, perhaps advanced manufacturing, but our customers certainly do. And we see how this is unlocking that uncertainty, which is the biggest Achilles heel towards these types of investments. So undoubtedly a game changer, going to have a tremendous impact. We're seeing it already. And I know this is a U.S.-focused conversation, but the question is, how can we use it as a template to help other countries enact similar things? I want to focus on the second point, because I'm going to have a very specific view on this in terms of how do we get the benefits from it. And I think my guess is we're all united in being in favor of the Inflation Reduction Act. I know C2AS had a critical role in the success of it leading up to it. And if we're all united, we have to be united front in the implementation. We're on a race against the clock here to get it implemented so everybody can have the full benefit of these 10 years, and also the full benefit of the climate benefits of doing that as quickly as possible. And even though Congress has passed the law, it's just a tool, and there's other steps. The tool has been entrusted to companies to implement it, but there's some other steps along the way. And so I really urge those who are stakeholders in this, whether you're an industry, an NGO, a think tank, that we need to come together and be a united front. Make this as expeditious for the government as we can, not be shooting arrows at each other or inconsistent comments, and trying to streamline this for them. I think that burden is on us. I think there's an opportunity to succeed there in a way we never have before. I think there's more to come on that. My guess is from C2S and from some of the companies. And I would just invite those who are watching out there to kind of be part of this united front that I think we can do to make sure this gets implemented as efficiently as possible, because it really rests on us at this point, and we have to deliver.
Thank you. So, Guy, what are your thoughts on how the Inflation Reduction Act affects National Grid's investments?
Well, I think it's not just National Grid. I think it's a broader sort of economy. So I think we play a role. We see ourselves as a catalyst, of course, because of the leader role that we've got in the value chain in terms of delivering these sort of networks. But to your point earlier, I think that, this is an opportunity to collaborate. It creates a long-term incentive to take greater risk, share the risk, and a lot of these will be see-through as benefits to end consumers. So I think, it is the way we see it. From outside in this is just is a significant shift in terms of the commitments that the government is making. I think in terms of, how do we get that from a great opportunity into something that materializes and that leverages further investment? I think it is important that we maintain momentum, we focus on scale. It's very easy with this type of initiatives that, we try and do everything, and I think it's important that we set real milestones and flagship projects that will really set the pace of what is going to be developed. We talked about multiple different technologies. Each one carries their own sort of risks, and we've got regions, and like the IAJEA is trying to cover like hubs across the whole of US. So I think it will be very important as a sort of starting point that we focus on those large transformational projects that will then sort of bring everyone along that sort of journey. And I think sort of the other thing for us from our perspective is, particularly sort of the IRA, it's a significant immediate benefit, and it reduces sort of the cost, for example, of hydrogen as a number of other incentives. But at the same time, I think it's also providing a platform of collaboration and partnerships. So what we found, and this is just something that is happening now, is up until now, everyone was working in their own silos. And I think that collaboration sort of translated into real partnership, joint developments, learning, because there's a number of technologies that will enable all of these projects to be bankable, to get the sort of the long-term investment cases. I think it's going to be critical. So I think that's another big dimension that we're seeing as a shift in the real world in terms of what is happening right now, which I think is part of what we're trying to anchor in this COP27.
Mars, what are your thoughts? Thank you, Guy.
On the energy side, it sort of goes without saying, but this is a huge shot in the arm for the industry to really scale up deployment. And my hope is that what this does is supercharge the role that corporate procurement can play in rolling out clean energy on the grid. We've seen, I think to date, there's 58 gigawatts of wind and solar that's installed in the U.S. today, or contracted at least in the U.S. today, that's dedicated to a corporate. So this is a phenomenon that's not just about CSR for businesses, but that really is fundamentally helping transform the grid. And so, as the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act are rolled out, I think our hope is that corporate procurement will really continue to be a driving force for rapid decarbonization, because there's certainly no time to waste. The other piece of this that's particularly interesting for us is the expansion of 45Q to include direct air capture and the expanded incentives for CCUS. As we mentioned earlier, I think we see an important role for scaling removals technology and being able to work with providers that now have an incentive that's going to really help them deploy these kinds of technologies. Is a great opportunity to start really scaling removals tech.
So I want to end with a question that really has us thinking ahead. And if we could imagine ourselves in the year 2027, we're 5 years from now, and a lot of what we talked about has come to fruition. There's a lot of sustainable aviation fuel. You've got a lot of offshore wind. You've got a lot of cities and companies doing 24/7 no problem in other parts of the world. You have hydrogen and renewable natural gas flowing through pipelines. And part of that was because of the Inflation Reduction Act, and part of that was also because of the public-private partnerships we've seen. Can you think of one thing that we did now that got us there in 5 years? And I won't go in order, because I realize this is a curveball, so I will let whoever wants to go first. What's one thing that we can do now that will get us there? Or what's one thing we did now that got us there?
I think it all starts with like real collaboration and sharing knowledge. I mean, what we've seen that we are facing a big challenge, a complex problem ahead of us with multiple technologies and multiple views in terms of what are the technologies. So I think that the one thing I would like to see us in 5 years' time is realizing there was a no regret to go after a lot of these at the same time. And I think, and we will only learn that over time to see that the benefit is to have that diversity of solutions, diversity of learnings along the journey, and making sure that as we go along, we continue to create optionality. I think in the past, we've been a lot of our energy sources have been sort of sourced with a single gas type. And I think the future is already providing a much more exciting, diverse world. So I'm really hoping that's something that we won't regret in 5 years' time.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I really echo what Guy said. The collaboration, and not only in the U.S. but globally on this issue, and that there has been a lot of global focus, and I think if we continue to do that, that's excellent. These are global solutions. And the fact that nobody is getting fixed in on it's only A, because of course it's A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way to Z. Many different things need to happen, but I think the openness that people see in the variety of solutions that exist to address this, in that unity in purpose, that I think we're seeing. Of course, it's not perfect, but at a higher level than in many other global problems. I think if that continues, that really helps to enable this. And this, as Guy mentioned, this broad focus on the variety of technology solutions that are needed to bring this about.
And I think you're hearing this theme of... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Roger.
I think you're hearing this theme of collaboration, which I would agree. I would even go further to say it's going to be odd bedfellows that what's going to separate the next 5 years from the past is collaborations with groups that typically haven't collaborated together as much. There's always examples of collaboration between NGOs and companies, but that's going to become the norm. Governments, companies, NGOs, all partnering together globally, even competitors with each other towards these shared goals. I think we're talking a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. That may be the proof point for that, getting all these folks in the room to be unified in how we're commenting and engaging and advocating. We saw that in the run-up to the IRA. C2ES, again, pulled together very diverse stakeholders to do that. But I think that is now going to become the norm if we're going to be successful with this notion of these different types of groups coming together and collaborating.
Thank you. Mars?
Well, I was going to pile on the collaboration theme. I think we've come to this COP very optimistic that we now have the ambition in place. I think globally, 80% of emissions, 90% of GDP, and 80% of global population are covered by some kind of net zero pledge, and that is a sea change from where we were just 3-4 years ago. We didn't have anything like that, and so that is, I find that very, very hopeful. And we've heard this many times. This is an implementation COP, and this is really about shifting from ambition into action. And I think the way we do that is through what we've heard on the panel, is through collaboration and partnerships. And I think that's not just within sectors where we're bringing buyers and sellers together to really understand how do we deploy technology faster, but also working across sectors. How do we bring cities and governments and international governments together to understand what policies need to change to really scale deployment?
Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists. We had Ben Driggs from Honeywell, Roger Martella from GE, Guy van Nieuwenhove from National Grid, and Mars Hanna from Google. And I'm Verena Radulovic from C2ES. And thank you so much for this conversation.